impact on national security. Because you don't, you don't get a lot of credit for it publicly, in the sense of personal satisfaction, in knowing that you did something that made such a difference in winning the Cold War. Ultimately, these programs and their followers enabled that. And what it feels like at the technology end of it, the engineering end of it, having been the folks who built the things to make.
Take her comments first on the.
Why don't we do that?
Okay.
Okay, we're ready, we're rolling.
As I stated earlier, the decision for the subcontractors on Corona, that is those under Lockheed, those decisions were made by the CIA people. We were CIA and I guess Air Force people. We were told that we would use General Electric for the reentry body. There were two individuals that I worked very, very closely with on that. One was Ingard Clausen, who was kind of the program manager for General Electric, and he was working under Hilly Page, who I think was general manager of that division at the time. And he had an administrator, contract type person by the name of Bob Aiken. We used to thrash around on that problem between the two companies, two large corporations fighting over this design of this little thing. But we were a very, very good teamwork group. And the engineering in the reentry capsule was partially done by Lockheed and partially done by GE, just as GE made contributions back to our portion in the integration and the overall vehicle. It was a very good relationship, and it led to the fact that in future years it became a major competitor of Lockheed in later systems. The camera instrument was quite interesting. As I said earlier, the very first football type design that we had used a Fairchild Camera Company built panoramic camera that was used on a Ryan airplane of some type. And it would scan from side to side and store the film in strips as it went forward on the Earth's surface. I guess it was that beginning that caused the CIA to make the decision to go to Fairchild for the camera that they wanted to build here, and it was again a panning camera, much bigger than the one that is going to be, I guess, on display in the Smithsonian. Very shortly thereafter, the individuals from, and I can't give you names from the Fairchild people, it just escaped me at the present time. But pretty soon the iTech organization came into being, and a very key player on that was Walter Levison, Dr. Walter Levison, who was a Boston College graduate and very interested in panoramic cameras, and he came up with a design which I think was the one that was mostly the benefit to the Corona program. And then there was an arrangement on that, even though iTech came up with a design, that the camera would be built by Fairchild. So it was an arrangement by the government to take the best ideas from the two companies and put it together in where they thought they could best get the camera built in the short period we had of 9 months. Later, iTech took over the bulk of the business in that regard. But again, a very, very close working relationship, because you can imagine integrating a panning camera with film running over rollers and stuff inside a cone of a vehicle in orbit that is total vacuum, and then threading its way into a recovery capsule on a spool, and then closing that off so it wouldn't leak with water if we happened to land in the water. And that kind of engineering problem became pretty much a necessity of close work between Walter Levison and his people and the group that I had working for me in the vehicle. But both good, all three of those companies, very good company to work with, and a very good cooperation between the individuals. Now, working on the from an engineer's point of view, it was very, very disappointing when we would have a failure. We could look at the engineering data and say, there's a great engineering success. We got the orbital velocity. That's a big success. Or we got the vehicle in orbit, and our objective originally was to only orbit this vehicle for 1 day. When we finally got to where we could have the vehicle have electrical power and thermal control and pretty good stability over its proper attitude control. For an entire day, we said that's an engineering achievement. We took great pride in that. Then, of course, we would have a failure. We'd have failure somewhere in the system. We'd either launch our recovery capsule off into another orbit by aiming it off in the wrong direction, or we would have some type of a failure. Well, those were very disappointing to us. But the next flight, and with the great support we had from Washington and from our program people, we were able to keep trying. It wasn't until the 13th flight that we actually completed everything we planned to do. But all of us in the engineering part of the side, and as a contractor engineers, were very, very pleased when on Discovery 13 we got the film back. It went to Washington we were given great kudos for the work we had done, and we felt very, very not good about that. And you never forget that kind of a thing.
Did you have a sense at that time of the real national significance of the program would be over?
We of course didn't know everything going on in the Washington area about the importance of the program, even though we'd been told. But in these frequent trips that Lee Battle and Fritz Oder and I would take back to Washington to reassure people, to explain what was going on, we certainly did know that it was a very, very important thing. There was a man in Washington, the head of the National Photo Interpretation Center by the name of Art Lundahl, who was just a peach of a fellow to work with and had a tremendous experience in photo interpretation and intelligence analysis. And he kept us very well posted. Matter of fact, when we became successful in 13 and 14 and 15 thereon, each time I would go back, he would show us the pictures that we had taken, pat us on the back, and say he showed this picture to President Eisenhower, he showed this picture to President Eisenhower, and we got good congratulations from President Eisenhower by that technique. So we felt good about that, and we could see that this was really very important. And considering that it was a much better solution to reconnaissance, overhead reconnaissance, we thought, than airplanes, even though Kelly Johnson, one of my Lockheed superiors, was responsible for those programs, we thought we had a better solution. And we did. Technically we did. Resolution-wise we did. And it turned out to be a very big, growing national intelligence thing. And we knew it.
Why don't we comment a little bit on the evolution of the Corona program and how the quality improved. Even from the early, the 14th mission, the camera worked, but by the end of the mission, how the quality had improved so much.
Yeah. The operation of the camera and the processing of the film, at the beginning, we were happy just to get a picture. Maybe like Thomas Alva Edison, we finally did really get the light to burn, or Marconi finally got the message. So we did have an actual picture from orbit, and it showed that the panoramic system would work. The resolution, as I remember, I'm a little hazy on this, but it was about equivalent to what the U-2 was developing at the time, and I think that was about like a 20-foot resolution, 10-foot resolution, something like that. But there were pictures, and it made people kind of happy. We did have a lot of problems. We had a lot of problems with the film. The film tended in vacuum to break up, to be very fragile, and sometimes break and cause a loss of film. The processing system, I think, was always very well done, but our image motion compensation and our vehicle control was such that resolution wasn't perfect. These things we took them step by step and improved them until finally the resolutions got down to where, as I remember, we were looking like 2-foot resolution, 1-foot resolution at the best. And of course this made people very happy because the primary thing that they were looking for was the Russian ICBM missile holes and missile sites. And that kind of resolution was adequate for that. We started off with a single camera. And it was just a straight panoramic camera. Then we decided that it would be better. We didn't decide, the government decided, and contracted with the camera company to build a stereo camera, which actually 2 cameras at an angle. So we would look at with one camera we would look as we would go forward over the area, with the other camera we would look as we went past the area, put the 2 together and get a stereo pair. Now they could use stereoptic techniques and get the 3rd dimension. And that was a big improvement. And we went to better films all the time, eventually, of course, color films and things like that. So there was a constant evolving improvement in the camera operations, constant evolving improvement in the vehicle control portion, which made the camera be able to take a better picture. Recovery by this time was routine. We had no concern about recovery. Air snatch recovery worked almost every time. I don't think we, after Discovery 13, that we ever really lost a vehicle due to recovery. So the system really did work. And eventually we decided, hey, it's working so well, why don't we double the capacity? We started out with a 1-day operation, then we went to 2 days operation, then we took the objective of going for a week's of operation. And things were going pretty well, so we said, let's go for 2 weeks. But by this time, programming the camera was such that they wanted more film. So we put 2 capsules on the vehicle and went from one into the other, and we were able to double the capacity in that process. So it was constantly improving, And that really led to later generations of the same basic techniques in more advanced systems.
Good. You know, not necessarily, as we talked in the other room, not necessarily, in fact, I'm sure, not for inclusion in the commemoration in May, but if you'd like to comment on the interaction between the Air Force and the conflicts and the turf wars between the Air Force and the CIA, back then and later as director of the NRO, I think that would be good to capture for historical purposes.
Relative to the working relationships between the Air Force and CIA as I observed them, first as a Corona contractor, Corona program manager contractor, I could see no problem. That was absolute, perfect, harmonious working relationship between the people who were briefed. There weren't many briefs, and they got along very well, as I have described. As the program got bigger and there were more people looking over, we still had a good working relationship between those who were on the Corona Discoverer program. After the success of Corona and of Discoverer and other progress made in other military satellite systems and so forth, there grew a kind of a competition between 2 very capable development groups, one being in CIA. Dr. Bud Wheelon was a leader of that, and one of the people he had working for him, Joan Crowley and Les Dirks, were just an outstanding development team. And I'll give Bud Wheelon the credit for that. He went in there as this very, very ambitious, smart PhD to build up this development capability within CIA. And they did such a good job that they kind of surpassed, outmaneuvered the Air Force portion, who were doing the same kind of thing. So that went on for a number of years in there. Later, when I was appointed as director of the National Reconnaissance Office, I saw this firsthand because both of those organizations reported to me. One, the Air Force side doing things that they were doing, and the CIA group doing the things they were doing. I was forced to tell General Culpa, who at the time was in the Air Force side of the house, because he was complaining about the fact they weren't getting some of these more important programs. I said, you're simply going to have to improve your development group because they're outdoing you. They've got a better team, they're coming up with better innovative ideas, and that's what you've got to do. Well, that's what Culpa did. They did, we'll go into the technical details of things that probably are classified still, but he was able to put together an Air Force team that took a next step and kind of hopped over the CIA on a couple of areas, and it's been that way ever since. Actually, the 2 groups in competition is not bad. If the competition is such that they're hindering each other, that's very bad. But if it's just a good, clean competition, just like competition in contractors, is a good thing. And it's not a bad situation at all with the right people.
That was useful. That's good. What else, Bill? Lindsay, did you
I think that you hit most of
Yeah.
it.
Good, good. No, that was very, I think,
How about, and any vignettes, anecdotes, funny stories? We might capture some of them later if the 2 or 3 of you are together, but are there any that come to mind that
You
that
mind
you
going
talk
back to-
about over a drink when you all get together?
You mind going going back to the mice story again.
Not at all.
We'd love to.
Well, some of the vignettes that are humorous things that one thinks back on, which weren't funny at the time, particularly, but I had previously discussed some of the launching 4 mice. Well, one particular time we'd housed the mice in their house, we put them in the capsule, put the capsule on the top of the Eugene, put the Eugene on the top of the Thor, and we're pretty much ready to the launch. Matter of fact, the thing was standing there beautifully ready for an early morning launch out of Vandenberg. And of course, all engineers and military CIA people who were part of the program were there watching this because this is a big event to see the thing leave. Well, all of a sudden, the technician reading the telemetry data said, "I don't get any response from the mice." And so we looked at the data and said, well, maybe something's wrong with the instrumentation. We all looked at everything we had to try to determine whether we had a system failure. And finally, we had to say, well, one of the guys came up and he said, "I think the mice have gone to sleep." And so we reported that through the system all the way to Washington. And I don't know which person in Washington came back with the answer, but I always thought it was General Schriever. Said, well, why didn't somebody go up and hit the side of the Aegina and see if you can wake them up? Of course, the fact of the matter is the mice were already dead. We had somehow lost the air conditioning within the capsule, and the mice had long since expired. And they weren't really asleep; they were just plain dead. So
That's good.
Very good story.
Yeah. Let's see, I think
So
we,
all the big decisions went back to Washington, how to wake up the mouse.
Yeah. They handled the big
we
stuff.
could go on some of these things. One of the things, I don't think we've got time if I'm not on the tape, but you were talking about how, the element of trust between the government and industry, but yet on the other hand, you had government that was directing subcontracts and making a lot of the programmatic decisions that could be given to the prime. That seemed almost like a contradiction in a sense. Technically, it sounds like there wasn't much questioning. They basically trusted the Lockheeds and General Electrics, but on the other hand, would direct some of the contracting action.
in the contracting business, Lockheed prided itself on being a prime contractor. Prime contractor means we would pick the subcontractors and everybody would report to us, and we were responsible for the whole thing, the development, the financial end of it, and schedule and so forth. And at the beginning we were. These cases on the Corona program, because of the particular management they had, they made decisions and handed those down to us. But for many, many years there was a big problem as to whether the Air Force, the primary contracting agent in the kind of work that in military satellites, there's always a big issue is should you have prime contracts or associate contracts. If you have associate contracts, that means that somebody else picks a subcontractor and somebody else administers the other contract, even though they would give what we at Lockheed give us the prime contract responsibility of integration. So we generally had a two-hat job. Now, naturally, because of the finances business, a prime contract makes more money than just a leading contract because he's got the whole contract under him. But it's worked both ways. And the way they do it now, with mostly associate contracts, that forces the government to put in a measure of oversight and supervision. And they have to build staffs within the CIA or within the Air Force. They have to go to organizations like the Aerospace Corporation to assist them technically in this job of integrating across a large number of contractors. The programs that we run today are really so complicated, I think it would be hard for the original version of Lockheed's prime contract management to work. I think you're better off today with what we are now doing. Take a program like Milstar, for example. It was very well run, I think, by the Air Force and by the assistance that the Air Force got from Aerospace Corporation and from other specialists. So it's that kind of a situation. It's evolving. I think you have to set your management system up to match the nature of the program. But once again, any program that I think that any government agency creates ought to have incentive contract of some type. I remember one evening, very about 2 o'clock in the morning, sitting in the satellite test center where we were controlling a satellite. In this case, it was a General Electric satellite that was in very deep trouble. And General John Martin was the important man at that time. And John said to me, he said, Jim, he says, you know, there ought to be something that we could do in our contracting, that if the contractor does a good job, he gets a reward. If he does a bad job, then he doesn't get the reward. He says, I'm left with nothing. The program has failed. I have nothing to prove for the money that we spent. That was really the beginning of the incentive contract. So we worked on some incentive contract proposals for General Martin, and they became pretty much the standard throughout the rest of the time and worked very effectively. Effective for Lockheed, certainly. That is, Lockheed made more money. But also effective for the Air Force, because the Air Force started getting what they were paying for, data, and lots of it. And I strongly recommend incentive contracting for anything of the type that we were working on. I had an opportunity when I was director of the NRO, having worked my way up through many of these things and working with the people in Washington for a lot of years, and that's why I was asked if I wanted to have that job. But working in the environment of the NRO, when the NRO had really two bosses, only two bosses. One was the Secretary of Defense, that was Jim Schlesinger at the time, and the other was the Director of CIA, and that was President George Bush at the time. Our decisions, and Dick Helms preceded that before President Bush. But we would work up in the NRO with the NRO staff, a really outstanding group of officers, mostly some CIA representation, work up a program plan. And I was cautioned by Jim Schlesinger when I first took the job. He said, Jim, he says, you've got to do two things. He says, you're Undersecretary of the Air Force. There your job is to manage 1 million people. He says, you're also NRO, and your job there is to manage, and to me, a pretty big number. But we'd work up a program and take it over, mostly to Jim Schlesinger. He would say, go do it as long as you've stuck to the constraints that I told you. But take it over to the Director of CIA, and either Dick Helms or George Bush would basically listen to our program and approve it. Don't think we ever got a change in the program we recommended. Very streamlined right to the top. In later years, as John McMahon can tell you, the situation grew. There was a staff in CIA. There was congressional oversight, advisory. So that relationship, I think the current DNRO doesn't have the single control of the issue nearly as much as I did. I think it was a mistake, but it's worked both ways.
Well, we could go on and on that.
How about one on, I don't know if we'll get Lee Battle or not on tape and everything, I'm not quite sure.
Yes.
But one of the things that he used was Battle's Laws. I don't know if you're familiar.
Battle's what?
Battle's Laws. Does that ring a bell? I was
I don't
going
know
to ask.
that one.
Okay.
Well, I could comment on Lee Battle.
Yeah, let's do that.
The person that I worked most closely with, day in, day out, night in, night out, was Colonel Lee Battle. Lee and I had this essentially weekly trip to Washington, D.C. to explain the situation. So we traveled together, and those were the days where you had 10-hour flights and 9-hour flights back and forth across the country. We had plenty of time to work on the airplane, talk together, work on the things we were going to present. We were going to Washington, we had a standard technique. Lee being the boss, really, he was the SPO, the System Program Officer. He would lead off, whether we were talking to the Undersecretary of the Air Force, or we're talking to somebody in CIA, or we're talking to some of the other General Schriever for one, or wherever around the Pentagon we had to go. Lee would do the 15-minute military oversight, and then I would have to stand up and do 30 minutes on the technical aspects, the reason for the failure in many cases, or the reason for the success later. And a working relationship I had with Lee was just absolutely outstanding. He was a very demanding officer. I think he studied under the school of Fritz Oder. Very demanding. He would stand for no back talk from a contractor. And he wanted certain things done, but on the other hand, he gave us the leeway to do what we had to do. And I remember the exhausting trips that we would make, coming home late at night down to Los Angeles, even though I was in Sunnyvale. We'd always come home by way of Los Angeles, and Lee's wife, Athene, was there greeting him, greeting me, and it just seemed like a really nice working relationship. And we're longtime friends, and I wish I could see more of him now than I can with him out in Hawaii. But it was just a really good relationship. And it was a lasting relationship. We didn't have a SPO for 1 year. We had a SPO for the entire program. And it really worked out.
You know, you mentioned his wife, Athene, and just, you know, off the record, he's made comments about how important she has been to him all the way through. And one of the things I hope that we can get, that we can communicate with this commemoration in May is being able to come out from the RAPS, the security RAPS, kind of compromises and sacrifices that the families have had to make. Now at least we can tell the families what their spouses, fathers, grandfathers accomplished. I think it's going to be.
Yeah. That's a very important thing because if a person, a man or woman, has the job, is working kind of hours we did, our standard working day was 11 hours. We generally work 6 days a week, and we use Sundays for makeup. That was our overtime time. And not paid overtime, just overtime time. So we worked tremendous hours, which meant we left home early in the morning, kids off to school. After we had gone home, we came home generally to a late dinner. And that was in the same thing for the contractors, for the military, and for the CIA people. So there were many, many sacrifices made within the home situation. And the poor wife, spouse, whichever it was, had to live with that. And here again, you couldn't tell them what you're doing. Why do you have to go to Washington? I can't tell you. Who are you visiting in Washington? I can't tell you. You know the rules. There was one exception, which another kind of a vignette I'd like to tell you. Somewhere along the line, about Discover 8 or 9 or somewhere in there, I got a call from Colonel Harry Evans, who was kind of our number 2 top military director. He said, "Jim, can you keep a total secret?" And I said, "Sure I can. That's my job." He said, "Then what we want you to do is go get a flag, a U.S. flag, and put it in the capsule in such a way that nobody will know what it is." So I said, "Where do I get the flag?" And he says, "Well, you go buy one." Well, we had just changed the shape of the flag right at that time. So I said, "I'm sure you wanted a proper flag." He said, "Yeah, it's got to be the proper flag." So I got on the telephone, and this was on a Saturday morning, and I was up in my little Redwood City office in Hiller, and I had a little Porsche Speedster at that time, and I called on the phone. I found down in South San Jose a hardware store that had some modern flags, and they had them in stock. And I said, "Well, how late are you going to be open?" He said, "I'll be open till noon." So I said, "Well, hold it for me. I'm on my way." So I jumped in my white Porsche, and I went down the Bayshore Highway. And I got there just as he was locking the door. And so he had the flags in. They were just exactly what I wanted. So I bought 3 of them, I think. So I had to go back to the plant and figure out, how am I going to get this flag in the capsule so nobody, even my own people, would know what that was. So what I did is I went to the shop foreman and I said, "I want to have you build some little 4x4 by 1/2 aluminum containers that I can rivet together to put some photo samples, some long endurance photo samples to see if I can measure cosmic rays." And then I took those little containers home, and I was going to fold up the flags and put them in there. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. No matter what I do to crush that flag in there, I couldn't get it in that little tiny box. So finally I broke secrecy rules. I called my wife in, my wife Mary. And I said, "Mary, you got to help me, but you can't ever tell this to anybody." I said, "Get your ironing board. Let's work on this flag." So she came and she ironed this flag, and together we got it to where we couldn't get it in there. And I riveted the sides up. I took it back, wrapped it in a black envelope, and said, "Do not expose to sunlight." So I was kidding everybody. And we put it in the capsule. Well, we lost the capsule. So we had to do the same thing until finally we did have a successful recovery. And that's the flag that was presented by the Air Force to General Eisenhower when he was president. Nobody ever paid me for that flag, for any of those flags. So that's really my flag that's in the White House.
It's a great story.
That's a
Okay.
great story.
And that is the end of this tape
Yeah.
here.
Seems
So
to
she
say-
ironed it up so small.